Most people lose because they react to the moment while other people shape the future. They focus on the visible conflict, the argument, the insult, the pressure, the emotional tension happening right now, without realizing the real game began long before that moment arrived. That is how psychological warfare works. The manipulative person is rarely trying to win one interaction. They are trying to shape your behavior over time. They provoke emotional reactions today so they can control more of your decisions tomorrow. And reactive thinking makes this easy because emotion narrows vision. When anger, fear, urgency, or ego take control, people stop thinking strategically. They focus on immediate relief instead of long-term positioning. They defend themselves too quickly, reveal too much, and make emotional decisions that quietly weaken their future leverage. Machiavelli understood something most people never learn. Kings shape conditions before battles arrive. They do not wait for chaos to appear before thinking ahead. They build positioning early, quietly, and strategically, while everyone else remains trapped inside the visible moment. Because the man who reacts emotionally fights the moment, the strategist controls what the moment becomes. In this video, you're going to learn how to think 10 moves ahead using strategic psychology, emotional detachment, and long-term positioning. Not as paranoia, not as overthinking, but as trained strategic foresight. Because most people are not losing due to lack of intelligence. They are losing because they react emotionally, while other people think structurally. Reactive people focus on today's tension. Strategic people focus on tomorrow's consequences. You'll learn why emotionally reactive individuals almost always lose to patient people, how manipulation traps are built slowly over time, and why emotional urgency destroys leverage before most people even realize it. You'll also understand how silence protects positioning, why emotional detachment creates clarity, and how future-focused thinking quietly becomes power. This is the difference between reacting like a pawn and thinking like an architect. Because kings do not merely respond to pressure, they study patterns, incentives, and outcomes before making decisions. They understand that every emotional reaction today can shape future vulnerability tomorrow. You are not an overthinker. You are an untrained strategist leaking energy. Reactive people almost always lose because emotion shrinks vision. The moment anger, fear, insecurity, or urgency take control, the mind becomes trapped inside the immediate moment. Instead of seeing systems, patterns, and long-term consequences, people focus only on emotional relief. They want to defend themselves immediately, win the argument immediately, fix the discomfort immediately, protect the ego immediately, and that emotional urgency creates weakness. Most manipulation works because people become obsessed with symptoms instead of structures. They focus on the insult instead of the pattern behind it. They focus on today's tension instead of the future behavior being conditioned through that tension. They fight emotional fires while ignoring the system quietly creating those fires repeatedly. That is why short-term thinking becomes dangerous. Every impulsive reaction may provide temporary emotional satisfaction, but it often weakens long-term positioning. Oversharing destroys leverage. Emotional outbursts destroy credibility. Defending yourself too quickly reveals insecurity. And constantly reacting trains other people to control your emotional state more easily over time. Strategic people think differently. They do not obsess over winning moments. They focus on controlling structures, incentives, and outcomes. They ask what behavior is being rewarded, what future is being built, and what position this interaction creates 6 months from now. Because if you need to win the argument today, you may lose the next 10 years. Most manipulation does not begin aggressively. It begins gradually, quietly, and almost invisibly. That is why so many people walk into traps without realizing they are being conditioned over time. The process usually follows the same sequence. First comes pressure, then pattern conditioning, then expectations, then punishment for resistance. Pressure is the test. Someone creates emotional tension, urgency, guilt, confusion, or discomfort, just to observe how you respond. Once they see your reaction repeatedly, a pattern becomes visible. They learn what triggers you emotionally, what you tolerate, what you fear losing, and how quickly you abandon your standards to restore peace. Then expectations are installed. Your emotional reactions become predictable. Other people begin assuming you will stay quiet, over-explain, apologize, tolerate disrespect, or sacrifice your boundaries under pressure. And once those expectations become normal, punishment appears the moment you resist. Suddenly you are called selfish, difficult, emotional, arrogant, distant, or unreasonable simply because you stopped accepting the role they trained you into. That is how small compromises slowly create future obedience. Machiavellian strategy understands that invisible setups create visible outcomes. Most traps are built long before the victim notices the final conflict. They begin through emotional comfort, gradual compromise, and conditioned reactions repeated over time. Pressure, pattern, expectation, punishment. Learn that sequence, and people become readable. Most people live at eye level. They see incidents, arguments, delays, emotional tension, and isolated problems. Kings think differently. They zoom out far enough to see systems, incentives, positioning, and long-term consequences hidden behind those events. That is strategic thinking. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" they ask, "What future does this create?" They study timelines instead of emotions. They evaluate leverage instead of appearances. They look at incentives because incentives often explain behavior more accurately than personality ever will. This changes everything. A king does not only see disrespect, he sees a status negotiation. He does not only see workplace tension, he sees shifting power structures. He does not only see emotional conflict, he sees conditioning patterns shaping future expectations. Because strategic thinking means reading consequences early. Most people react emotionally to visible events after the damage already exists. Strategic people study the invisible architecture producing those events before the collapse arrives. They understand that long-term outcomes are usually built through repeated small patterns, not dramatic moments. That is why positioning matters more than emotional reactions. The strongest individuals are rarely the most emotional people in the room. They are the people thinking furthest ahead, while everyone else remains trapped inside temporary tension. Because most people see conflict, kings see architecture. If you're starting to realize how much of life is controlled by positioning instead of emotion, subscribe, because strategic thinking changes how you see everything. The most powerful strategies are usually invisible in the beginning. While reactive people focus on emotional battles happening publicly, strategic people prepare quietly behind the scenes long before conflict fully arrives. That is the invisible setup. Instead of waiting for problems to explode, they reduce future vulnerability early. They build documentation before they need evidence. They create options before they become trapped. They develop quiet alliances before pressure increases. And they protect leverage by controlling how much information, emotion, and intention they expose publicly. Because preparation is stronger than reaction. Most people only start thinking strategically after damage already exists. But kings understand that power grows silently before it becomes visible. The strongest position is often built during periods where nobody notices anything important happening at all. This requires emotional detachment, not numbness, but enough discipline to resist reacting impulsively every time pressure appears. Quiet preparation often looks unimpressive to emotional people because it lacks drama, validation, and immediate vindication. But over time, hidden leverage compounds. Suddenly, the prepared person cannot be cornered easily, cannot be manipulated through urgency, cannot be destabilized by emotional pressure as easily as before, because the strongest position is built long before anyone realizes you're preparing. Most people are not defeated by lack of intelligence. They are defeated because emotion hijacks their intelligence under pressure. Anxiety creates panic. Ego creates impulsive reactions. Fear creates over-explanation. Anger creates short-term thinking. And once emotion takes control, clarity disappears. That is why emotional detachment becomes the foundation of strategy. Strategic people still feel pressure, frustration, disappointment, and uncertainty. The difference is that they do not allow those emotions to make decisions for them automatically. They pause, observe, delay reaction, and that delay alone creates enormous psychological advantage, because detached people think clearly under pressure, while emotional individuals rush to defend themselves, explain themselves, or restore immediate comfort. Disciplined individuals focus on consequences, leverage, and positioning. They understand that emotional urgency often creates mistakes that become expensive later. This is not coldness, it is clarity. Detachment does not mean becoming numb, emotionless, or incapable of caring. It means refusing to surrender judgment to temporary emotional states. You can care deeply and still remain strategic. You can feel emotion without obeying it impulsively. That level of emotional discipline changes how you handle conflict completely, because emotional detachment is not the absence of care. It is the refusal to let emotion control judgment. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to feel validated. They want approval, recognition, emotional reassurance, and immediate vindication whenever conflict appears. But the need for validation creates weakness, because it makes your emotional state dependent on other people's reactions, and dependency destroys leverage. Strategic people think differently. Instead of obsessing over approval, they focus on building options, boundaries, patience, and quiet power. They understand that leverage matters far more than emotional satisfaction in the moment, because silence protects position. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every misunderstanding requires explanation. Not every challenge deserves emotional engagement. The strongest individuals often remain calm while quietly improving their position behind the scenes. They build alternatives before they need escape. They reduce dependency before pressure increases. They create leverage long before confrontation arrives. That is strategic patience. Most emotional people cannot tolerate temporary misunderstanding because the ego craves immediate relief. It wants to prove itself right instantly. But kings understand that long-term advantage matters more than winning emotional moments publicly. This is why quiet power becomes dangerous. The person obsessed with appearances often sacrifices future leverage for present validation. Meanwhile, disciplined individuals protect positioning, even if it means remaining misunderstood temporarily. Because the ego wants immediate vindication. The strategist wants long-term advantage. At the highest level, strategy is no longer about reacting better. It is about thinking so far ahead that emotional chaos loses the ability to control your direction. That is the real transformation. You stop chasing immediate validation. Stop reacting impulsively. Stop sacrificing long-term positioning just to satisfy temporary emotion. Instead, you begin building quietly. Silence becomes leverage. Emotional control becomes protection. Patience becomes power. And long-term thinking becomes psychological dominance. This is the shift from reactive to kingly. Most people destroy their future trying to protect their present ego. They react emotionally, overshare under pressure, force outcomes too early, and make decisions designed to relieve temporary discomfort instead of strengthen long-term positioning. But kings understand something different. Every emotional reaction creates consequences. Every impulsive decision shapes future leverage. And every moment of discipline compounds into strategic advantage over time. That is why strategic patience creates power. I do not react to the moment. I build for the future. Because the man who learns to think beyond immediate emotion becomes difficult to manipulate, difficult to pressure, and almost impossible to corner psychologically. The man who thinks 10 moves ahead becomes almost impossible to corner. What destroys more futures? Emotion, ego, or short-term thinking?